good. Well, thank you all for coming today. I'm going to try not to swallow the mic, but you're going to hear me. I guess this is what we have. I want to thank Reverend Harris for flushing some of you closer. Thanks for doing that. I'm excited to teach. This is our final session of disciple history. We're going to cover from Reconstruction, which is sort of 1950-ish forward. I'm looking around the room and really realizing that, honestly, Reverend Warren or Reverend Harris should be probably teaching this. You lived it more fully than I did. Most of my ministry came after the vote on Reconstruction, so I got to experience what it was like to live it out. But that's where we're going to begin, and let's just get going. We're going to cover the post-World War II of the church, restructure itself. I keep wanting to call it Reconstruction. It may have felt like Reconstruction from the 1860s, but it was actually restructure. And then our current state of affairs, and then growing edges for the future of the church. I don't know if you recognize any of those ladies. That's the 1931 Young Women's Bible class of this church.
I'm not there.
And Virginia is not there.
Looks like the young women weren't young men either.
No.
I've looked. I found a few of the ladies are trying to smile. Most of them are no. They're not. Well, the disciples in the 1950s, that was sort of our heyday in a way, because of how you think of church, but as far as numbers go, that was sort of the heyday. That picture is a postcard that I found of our previous building from 1948. In the 1950s, we sort of peaked, like a lot of mainline Protestant churches, like a lot of organizations, whether it was Rotary Club or the Kiwanis, a lot of social clubs, congregations, they all peaked in the 1950s, post-World War II. At that time, we peaked at about 2 million members. In 1958, we had 7,700 congregations. In 1948, our denomination were part of the forming core of the World Council of Churches. Even though the disciples are not the largest denomination, our founders' passion about Christian unity made us sort of those core churches that helped form the World Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches. And we have been active participants in those ever since. But those were exciting times. They were so exciting, we felt like we needed to do something to think about the future. And being good modern disciples, all about higher education and research, we wrote not just a report, 3 volumes of reports on what the future of the church could be. Can you imagine if our 2024 vision team had presented 3 volumes of this material for the church to consider what to do next? That's what we did. These volumes are actually from my library upstairs. If you want to borrow them, they do make interesting bedtime reading. If you have insomnia, or if you have a passion for church history, they are fascinating because in a way, they're primary documents. They help us to read what our leaders were thinking as they led us into restructure. So there's a volume on reformation of the tradition as they're thinking about the theology of our church and where it's going and where it's growing, and then about the revival of the congregations. It is some interesting reading in places, maybe not all of it, but some of it is quite fascinating. And it's all there to be borrowed if you want. Another interesting piece about those works, they were published by Bethany Press. Bethany Press was the forerunner of Christian Board of Publication. Maybe some of you remember the Sunday school curriculum that we used to get from the Christian Board of Publication, now known as Chalice Press, as it's kind of gone through its rebranding over the years. Early in my ministry, I could actually drive to Christian Board of Publication in St. Louis. I served in the St. Louis area, and buy things from a store. We actually had a retail store in St. Louis where you could go buy your curriculum. Times have changed. What did restructure do? One of the things it did, it moved us from being a convention to being a denomination. Reverend Harris showed us a great picture last week of one of our great conventions that was held in a baseball stadium, where we filled that stadium with people. So we were a convention. We were people that convened. We went from being a convening group to being a denomination, a group that was denominated as unique and separate. We tried to state our identity as a denomination. Some of us, thinking backwards, are kind of cynical, like myself, and think, well, we've been acting like a denomination for a long time. We just finally owned up to it, got honest with ourselves about who we were. Another thing that Restructure did, it moved us from contractual relationships to covenant relationships. So now instead of us relating to each other in a contractual sense, like a business, we tried to think about our relationships in more of a covenant. We promise to do things. We promise to support each other and find more theological grounding for what we're doing. We instituted as a denomination a structure that you may know today as General Board, which is the General Board of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. Our regions, which we know as the Capital Area Christian Church, and then congregations, First Christian Church Hagerstown. In Restructure, we tried to say each of those expressions of church are equal to each other. It is not a hierarchy. I don't know that we always live that out. I don't know that we always understand that correctly. But in essence, what we were trying to say is that when the General Board meets, when the General Assembly meets, the General Assembly does not speak on our behalf. They speak to us, just like we speak to them. Well, that was the ideal. Not always understood well. And sadly, at times, the General Assembly has done things, passed resolutions, it gets in the newspaper, the rest of the world doesn't understand what we're doing, and they think that it speaks for us. Restructure was supposed to help us with unity and mission. It was supposed to help us to think more clearly and act more clearly, to share our mission together. But one of the consequences of that was the loss of congregations. Really started back in the 1920s. But when we voted in 1968 to be a denomination, there were thousands of our sister churches who decided that wasn't for them. Reverend Harris went over some of those congregations last week, but it's a shocking number. One of the stories is that what I just said. We voted to be a denomination and they left. But there's more to that story. Have you read this book? It was written by the president of Lexington Theological Seminary, as he researched one of the reasons that we lost churches. It wasn't just because of the vote he took. Some of our cousin churches, the other streams of the Stone Campbell movement, created a strategy to take over our churches. My student church was in Eastern Kentucky. And back in the day, my student church and 19 other congregations would gather for an annual meeting. It was great. Fish fry, revival preaching, hymn fest, the whole works, whole week. We rotated it from one congregation to the next. When I got there, one of my colleagues let me know that of the 20 Christian churches, only 2 were still disciple. We still gathered because we were neighbors, we knew each other. But 18 of those churches have been taken over by other streams of the movement. Cincinnati Bible College was one of those schools that sort of helped implement the strategy of sending young graduates into these country churches take them over, and lead them out of the denomination. So some of it was our choices. We chose to behave in certain ways as a denomination that sort of ostracized others who didn't agree. Some of it was other streams of the movement actively trying to take churches out of the denomination. And then some of it was, quite frankly, declining birth rates in our country and changing demographics. A lot of our churches were founded wherever you could find grain silos. So wherever there were grain silos, that's where the farmers came, and so we planted a church there. Those became our county seats. That's where we put a church, especially through the Midwest. But over time, especially post-war America, post-World War II America, we saw our urban cities grow. We saw population shift from the Midwest down into the Sun Belt, down into what we call the Bible Belt. And suddenly, congregations that had been thriving 100 years ago found their communities shrinking. My home church, during my ministry, my home church has found itself serving in a town that is half the size it was when I was in high school. Because there's no jobs there. They raised my generation, sent my generation to college, and then lo and behold, there weren't jobs for my generation to come back to, so we went somewhere else. So while I've served churches that were thriving, I have to listen to my poor folks talk about their church, which is not thriving. Not always because of something they did right or wrong, just the harsh reality of a congregation living in a community that has become half the size it once was. So those were some of the challenges that we've been facing the last half of the 20th century. In addition to this, you can add into those the challenges of changing society, changing cultural norms. All of those headwinds have been difficult for us to try and face. We've had our own internal divisions and controversies. Restructure raised the concern of congregational independence. That's where our vote to be a denomination caused some of our congregations to leave because they were afraid of losing their independence, even though restructure itself in no way lessened the independence of a congregation. I know this for a fact, because every congregation I've served has been pretty free to do whatever they want to do. Sometimes regardless of my own leadership. I think others in the room could probably vouch for the independence of our congregations. It's also one of our strengths, I'll say. While I can say sometimes it feels like a congregation being ornery or unruly, truth is, it's really one of our strengths. We've had theological debates, biblical interpretation issues, modernism, liberalism. These all have been headwinds that have been something for us to tackle. At times, there's been perceived disconnect between leadership and membership. When I was about to go to seminary, I remember some dear church members pulled me aside and said, "We're glad you're going to seminary, but don't let them change you." It's an interesting thing to say, right? Because that's what we truly value about education. It's going to help someone develop and grow, but yet I was being encouraged, yeah, go learn, but don't learn. It did lead somewhat to a disconnect at times, as some of our people in the churches didn't always appreciate the leadership that was provided. And then balancing unity and truth. Reverend Harris touched on this last week, and then interestingly enough, I'm in a clergy cohort that met, and that same issue came up. And some people see our denomination as struggling with two poles. One pole is that we are a movement. Our slogan as a denomination is that we're a movement for wholeness in a world that's fragmented. But we tried to hold that ethic from the start, that rather than being a denomination or somebody divided from somebody else, we're simply a movement of restoration, a movement of the good news. We are people on the move in mission. At the same time, we try to be a people of the table that is open and inclusive, radically open to anyone that loves Jesus or is curious about Jesus. We want to welcome them to the table. Tables are fixed things. Those two poles don't always work easily together. Movements have a direction and a destination that some people buy into and some people don't buy into. That's different than the table where we want everyone there. So those two realities, those two poles, have been part of our internal workings. As we've adapted to a changing society, we've tried to deal with what it is to serve in rural communities, and then what is it to serve in urban communities. Some of that is just the shifting dynamics of the world around us. And then within our urban communities, they have their own shifting demographics. A lot of us can name congregations who flourished when they were serving their neighbors, and then their neighborhood changed, and they wrestled with how do we flourish serving a different constituency that now live around us. We've wrestled with developing a more professionalized ministry. We expect a lot of our clergy, as we should. But it also makes it difficult to recruit future clergy when we tell them out of the box that what we expect is that you're going to go to school for probably 7 or 8 years after high school just to be ordained. So we've tried to come up with other fashions, like Reverend Harris mentioned last week, with commission ministry as an option for those who just don't have the time or opportunity to go to seminary, but they have years of experience that we want to value. And so we find ways to value that, and we name them commission ministers and provide them continuing education. Maintaining our identity and distinctiveness has been an issue. Our unity, this is back to the movement and table dynamic. Our love for unity has driven us to be very active participants in the ecumenical movement. Participating in the ecumenical movement sometimes lessens our uniqueness, right? Because we start to learn from other people, we start to adopt some of their practices, and then we're not always practicing maybe what our founders did. In some way, it's like going to seminary and trying not to learn anything. You start to hang out with your neighbors and you realize, oh, maybe my neighbors are doing some things that are really helpful, and we should learn from that. And that's been our experience at the denomination of the ecumenical movement. The hope and dream for us to maintain our uniqueness, though, is our uniqueness gives us a voice that's important to the ecumenical movement. Just as each of your voices is important to this congregation's vibrancy, like a tapestry, each of you are a separate thread that makes the tapestry beautiful. Our participation as a denomination in the larger ecumenical movement, we ourselves are a thread in that tapestry. So that was restructured 1968, and then we tried to live that out. We talked about some of the challenges that we tried to live with, some of the harsh realities of the world around us that created headwinds for us as a denomination. And then probably one of the pivotal moments in my ministry was the 2020 vision. I had been in ministry for a few years. I was starting to feel some traction in what I was doing. And Dick Ham was our general minister and president, and he and other leaders came up with what we call the 2020 vision. It was very exciting. The idea was that we would start 1,000 churches by the year 2020. We would revitalize 1,000 churches by 2020. We would become a pro-reconciliation, anti-racism denomination, and we would develop enough leaders to do all these great things. I was starting a new church when this came out, so I felt very excited to be part of that 1,000 churches that were being started. It was very hard, but very exciting work to start a church from the ground up. And so suddenly to find us to be one of those 1,000 churches was very exciting. When I left the new church start, I went to an established congregation that wanted to be revitalized, so then I got to be part of the 1,000 revitalized congregations, and we did that. We got younger and bigger and did all the things that we wanted to do. But honestly, as I tried to talk with my colleagues and work with our denomination on what is it to be a revitalized congregation, that leg of the four-legged chair, number 3, became very difficult. What helped the starting of 1,000 churches was some grant money. The Lilly Foundation from Lilly Pharmaceuticals, Lilly provided over $1 million in grant money to help us provide training and leadership to start 1,000 churches. It's also very easy to count 1,000 new churches. It was not a church, now it is a church. Very easy to count that. What was difficult on the revitalizing side, there was not the grant money to provide the leadership. That was a hard start. But it's also hard to decide what is a revitalized congregation in a denomination where congregations are so independent. After a few meetings I attended where most of the discussion was how do we define revitalized congregation, I decided I need to just go work on my congregation and let somebody else figure out what is it to be revitalized. Maybe we revitalized 1,000 congregations. I never heard a big celebration of that. And partly because it's just hard to define what is revitalized. What's the benchmark? Is it doubling your growth? Is it growing back to where you were in 1950? Is it having more ministry? I mean, there were so many ways to define what is a revitalized church. It was hard to celebrate that one. There's been a lot of work on becoming pro-reconciliation and anti-racist church. Our clergy are now required to go through training. When I was first ordained, you were ordained, you were given standing, and then you just went to work. Then over the years, we started to add to that. Boundary training, which is very healthy, as it reminds our clergy on how to be healthy and to have good boundaries with people. Another training that we required of our ordained clergy was pro-reconciliation, anti-racist training. A lot of other corporations in the secular world have added this kind of training to their continuing ed for their leaders and for their employees. We added this as well. But for a 2020 vision, how do you celebrate, is it accomplished or not? My experience of church life, we love it when we can celebrate something. So like today, I could stand up and say, we gave away 7 cases of water and we had 88 people give us their contact information. That is fun to celebrate. Hard to celebrate, have we achieved a pro-reconciliation, anti-racist state? Are we closer? Are we getting there? Are we on track? That is really hard to make. Thankfully, we're still in the fight. We're still trying our best, but that's been a hard one to celebrate. And then finally, leadership development, which I think is the one leg of the chair that we didn't do enough work on. I'm not certain why, but I think if we had done more focus on leadership development, all of this might have gone better. And I'm not just talking about ordained clergy, but just leadership development in general, I think, is a growing edge for the future of the church. We would be better off if maybe we had engaged that a little more earlier. The numbers of our current state of our denomination, again, back in 1958 was sort of our peak with 2 million members, and then most of my ministry has been lessening of the numbers. I was ordained in 1993. We were just under 1 million members. And so from the time I was ordained in 1993 to now, we're a quarter of the size. In 2023, we had 2,887 congregations and almost 7,000 clergy. But if you'll notice, less than half of our clergy are currently active in service. It's because of your generation. I'm just going to cast the blame. I'm joking because no one really deserves blame. It's just the reality that the boomer generation is huge, right? And you produced a lot of clergy, a lot of wonderful clergy who deserve to retire, right? When it's time, yes.
It's a good thing we didn't clap.
It did come out a little differently than I intended. I think of Reverend Upton, Reverend Harris, Reverend Warren. You all have served so well as church. You deserve the opportunity to retire. And so, but when it happens, my generation, the generation after me, are smaller. They're just numerically smaller. There are not as many people to fill the seats. There's not as many people to fill the seminaries. And so our seminary graduating classes are smaller. We're just producing fewer clergy than we used to. Now, demographics is not the only reason for that. I think there's other reasons as well. But demographics is one reality we can't readily change. Amy and I have decided not to have any more children. Thank you for not clapping for that. And then in gold I put our congregation. The average congregation in our denomination worships with 40 people or less in person on a Sunday morning. Last calendar year, our average in-house worship attendance was 184.
Aren't most of our churches smaller than those?
They are.
Oh, yes.
They didn't used to be. If you look at their sanctuaries, those sanctuaries were built for a different size congregation,
Okay.
by and large. Yeah. And a lot of congregations built new sanctuaries in 1960 because we were so big we needed more space. And we were so big we had the opportunity to do something. And so a lot of our congregations either moved or added a new sanctuary. The church I raised my son in, they took that opportunity. Well, they did it about 20 years later, but they added a new sanctuary. So our churches have done that. And then found themselves with a sanctuary that was a different size than they were as a congregation when they get to 2025. The future of the disciples, I took the opportunity to lay out what I thought were some of our future opportunities to grow. That is our church, if you haven't recognized it. The architectural team is getting closer and closer to having something for you to look at. And in the process, I borrowed this picture from them. This is just our current building. Mission focus, I think, is one of the strengths for us going forward. It's been a strength of this congregation. It's one of the reasons that I think we share church so well together is our passion for mission, for reaching out and serving our neighbor. If I think about the strong ministries of our denomination, it's our mission-focused ministries. I think there's no secret why this congregation is so passionate about Week of Compassion. It's the mission of Week of Compassion that we're passionate about. And so that's why we're so supportive of what they do. Because they are meeting the needs of our neighbors who have suffered from human and natural disasters every day around the globe on our behalf. Something that we could not do so well on our own. That's one of the reasons that we wanted to restructure so that we could more efficiently share ministry together. So in the late 1960s, we restructured to more efficiently share ministries. Leadership development. I think that's a key for our denomination and for this congregation. Emily Schuett, when she agreed to take on being vice president of the leadership board and the nominating team, one of the conversations she and I had was her passion with leadership development. So we may be starting not in January to look at next year's leaders, but in July. We may be starting this summer to start thinking through how can we develop leaders to take on the ministries that we so dearly value. Evangelizing the next generation, passing on the baton. That's going to be a challenge. One thing that did come out as we talked about what was it like to revitalize a congregation, passing the baton from one generation to the next was deeply embedded in that conversation. I'll bet many of you could tell me stories, because I've heard some of you tell me stories, of what it was like when the builder generation, those World War II folks, when the builder generation handed you the reins of the congregation. Sometimes they did it because they were so excited you were there. And sometimes you had to rip the baton out of their hand. How many congregations have had a matriarch in the kitchen who would not let go? Oh, I see the heads nodding. You can name the matriarch in the kitchen who struggled to let go of the baton of leadership in the church kitchen to the next generation. But if we don't, we simply create one more headwind for the church to fight against going forward. There's two ways that happens. One way that happens is finally a generation decides they're done and they just drop the baton on the ground and hope somebody picks it up. Leadership development and sharing the good news with the next generation is a way more helpful process of handing that baton on to the next generation. Carving out opportunities for people to experience leadership. Creating the opportunity and the ask, inviting them to share their gifts, getting to know them and know what they're good at, and then inviting them to use what they're good at to help the church's mission move forward. Adapting to new technology. I don't know why, one of the rabbit holes I was thinking through in the process of writing the sermon, I was thinking through music. And how many of the music that you and I love, maybe it was Matt Albright and I talking about Jimmy Buffett and his music, which will live on forever, probably. How much of that happens differently if technology had not developed as it did? Does Elvis Presley ever become the king without the technology to get his voice out to so many of us? The music industry obviously has adapted many times to changing technology. That's just one example. The church is in need to adapt to new technologies. That's one of the reasons that we're starting Shelby Next as our new church management software, because it provides new technological opportunities to engage our membership. And then being an inclusive community. Our denomination, like all denominations, have had plenty of things to fight over the years. We fought over, is the Bible inerrant or not? We fought over, should women be in ministry or not? Oh, before that, we fought over, should women be elders or not, right? We have fights over that. We have fights over, can people of different skin color be in the same church? And now, maybe, one of the fights is, what do we do with the LGBTQ community? We always seem to find a new community to fight over. Our tradition, the Disciples of Christ stream of this movement, has usually erred on the side of being inclusive. So where some of the other streams of the Stone Campbell movement have come out with different conclusions, not always thinking that women should be in ministry, not always reading the Bible in its socio-economic, historic context. Disciples have tended to err on the side of inclusion, being more liberal, more open-minded, more progressive, more welcoming, larger tent, bigger table. That's been our ethic. And I think that can be an ethic for us going forward. And thankfully, when we think about the future of the church, it's ultimately God's church, and not mine and not yours. When I think about what is the real hope and dream in the future of the congregation, because it will change as it adapts to technology, as it finds different ways to operate, different generations take over and put their thumbprint on the church, the congregation will change and adapt. Those people that founded our church 150 years ago, or the women in that 1931 Young Women's Bible Class, there'd be things that we're doing they just simply don't recognize and may not like. But what we do share in common, it's God's church. All right, questions?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
One of the most important things throughout our life at First Christian was the idea of who made the best macaroni and cheese. And I think we all can.
Bill, do you have a name to go with your name? Okay. Well, for those of you watching the recording, we just had that there was a fight over who made the best macaroni and cheese, and we're not naming the winner. But if they could share the recipe.
Well, Thelma was probably one of the kitchen.
And Mary Jane does.
And Mary Jane Broadway, yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
I never met a macaroni I didn't like.
There you go.
I find the number 278,000 members frightening. Because how can the denomination continue?
So the comment was, how does our denomination continue with these declining numbers and to reach a point of 278,000? That is a huge question. Currently, our denomination is trying to adapt some new structures that will streamline, sort of right-sizing. Some of you may know that word from the secular world, right-sizing itself to who we are. So some of that is going on to help us be more efficient and vibrant going into the future. Beyond that, though, beyond the moving the deck chairs on the Titanic, it is a very serious question about what we do going forward. During my ministry, there have been questions over the years of, do we merge with another denomination? So we've had conversations with United Church of Christ over the years, which resulted in us sharing some very significant partnerships that have helped us to do ministry better together, especially global ministries, overseas missions, those kind of works we've started sharing with other denominations. Our Week of Compassion often partners with groups like Church World Service and other local groups to be more efficient with the dollars that we provide. But yeah, what happens with the disciples of Christ? I think it's helpful to remember that we weren't always the Christian Church disciples of Christ. Even going back to our founders, Campbell, Stone, and the others, we have morphed and sort of changed over the generations. Sometimes we've split, sometimes we've grown as our own. But as long as God continues to find us useful, I'm confident we will be out there in some way providing a voice. It may not always look like the organizational structure that we grew up with. I don't know that that's always bad. My experience of doing a new church start, I grew up in a church like ours. Multi-staff, large, vibrant, county seat church. Tons of fun growing up in my own church. But that's what I knew. So when I was asked to go plant a new church start, it really pushed me to rethink, well, what does it mean to be church? I mean, we started with no people, no building, and no name. So then I had to think through as the leader, what is crucially important? What's the essential piece that I need to do first for us to be church? It also pushed me to truly rely on God in a way which I had not before. More often than I had ever previously in my life, did I talk to God and say, you called me into this. You want this to happen. I need you to step up and help make this happen. And it did. So sometimes losing the organizational structures, which is what I lost as a person when I did a new church start, there weren't any there. Sometimes losing those or seeing those change, if we take the opportunity, can be an opportunity to maybe send us in the wilderness for 40 years. Tim had one real quick.
Oh, I was just going to mention, I think it helps lots of times to revitalize the church if you have a new minister come on board or new associate minister, because they have different ideas in terms of getting the congregation to appreciate. I noticed that you frequently mention the ministries of this church, how varied they are. So I just think that helps a lot in terms of revitalizing if there are different ideas or different conferences that leadership goes to. But I think the other thing is, I think churches overall are losing membership right and left for a variety of reasons. Yesterday when I was trying to get people to sign up for a $50 gift card, and the one fellow says to me, I said, all you have to do is sign up. He says, well, I don't do churches. I said, that's okay, you don't have to sign in blood, just ink, and you'll take care of it. But I think that a lot of people see that for whatever reason. And another thing, I'm impressed by how the youth participate in church and then they go off to college and just seem to go away for whatever reason. I'm sure there are various reasons. But I think that's a challenge. How do we bring them back, and how do we pass that baton you're talking about on to the next generation?
Well, Tim, thank you very much for your support for Dr. French and I. And there is some truth and value, I think, when you bring new leadership in. Sometimes it can help an organization or a faith community take new steps. But I also want to say, when Dr. Brown was here to speak and he presented that certificate to our congregation, Dr. French and I had a conversation, and I let her know that neither she nor I would stand down there with them. To me, it was very important for Eva and for Larry to accept that, not Dr. French or I. The ordained clergy of this church have provided some great leadership. It's not because of us that you've thrived through 150 years. You thrived through 150 years by engaging the mission and ministry of the church, truly. So it should have been you two down there accepting that. At least that was my opinion. But I would like to think that we're useful in some way, so thank
I
you.
believe you are. I do believe you are. It's nice to see you carrying the flag, so to speak.
Reverend Harris.
It's not just the disciple church that is this major decline. If you look at the other churches in our community, you will see that in almost every existing old congregation around. We're still one of the stronger mainline churches in Hagerstown. The question I have is the shift toward independent congregations that are what I call mega church, which is around here we're not in competition with too many, but we do have that Waynesboro Otterbein Church. It used to be a Church of the Brethren that is now an independent congregation. Went that way totally in 2009, and it's probably the largest church in this community, right? And that, if you go to the city, you'll find that over and over again with these huge independent congregations. What's your thoughts about that?
So there is a movement currently of these small churches when they are about to close the door. A thriving church simply takes over their facility. It's a whole methodology and church strategy that exists. And there's obviously value in it because it's bringing people in relationship with Jesus. It's making sometimes better use of a facility that used to be empty is now full, where a thriving church that has figured out good methodology, good structures, they can come in with some missionary members to be like seed members, and they treat it sort of like a new church start, and they take over a facility that the congregation inside of it was dying. So there's a whole movement of that happening right now. And that's what we're seeing in these congregations that are, quote, non-denominational. They are denominational in the sense that they are connected usually to a mother church. We had our own mother church. Beaver Creek was our mother church at one time. At some point, I take our staff to leadership events that are not of our denomination because they have great methodology. One of the reasons that we go to Orange is not for their theology. We know our theology. We know what we believe about Jesus Christ and how we handle the Bible and how we serve our neighbor. But they have a lot to teach us as far as the methods, the strategies, the how-tos. What are people doing these days to organize Vacation Bible School? What are people doing these days to organize volunteers? That's the reason we go to those events, is to learn from other people. And I was encouraged early in my ministry to do it, and I've kept doing it. While there's a lot to learn from our sister churches and from our denomination, there is as much to learn from other people. So these other organizations that are growing, I'd like to go learn from that. So that's some of what we've been doing, and I think we may see more of that going forward, more of our clergy going to other traditions, educational events, either because our denomination got too small to offer them, or we decided to go learn what's working so we can replicate it. That's so much of ministry has been all along. We see what works in another church, and so we do it. Or we do something that works and we share it with somebody else. I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but. Kathy?
But something Fred said, and we're talking about the decline in membership in our church. What I wanted to ask, does anyone know if all denominations are down or going as low as we are?
Yeah, numbers are hard to count. Well, we can count, but are we getting the accurate read? Even of our own numbers, it's hard to actually know because not every congregation reports. But yeah, by and large, most denominations are shrinking. Yep. I don't know of a denomination that's not shrinking. But what Reverend Harris named, we know of megachurches that are growing, that are not reliant on a denomination. It's a congregation with usually it's a congregation with a leader who's assembled a team, implemented a strategy, it's taken off, and then they just spread that. Then they become multi-site, they take over other facilities from churches that are no longer effective, and that's how they've grown. I guess they're like a micro-denomination in a way.
I hear over and over, I have a friend of mine in our development where we live, and we're talking about his church that's had a series of ministers off and on, and he said, I'm afraid our congregation, our minister is too woke. We are a woke conference. And I said, well, isn't that the way it's supposed to be? And then it went downhill from there. But I mean, is that why some people are staying away from churches because they don't agree with what Jesus would want us to be?
So the question was the impact of wokeness on the church. That's been part of the headwinds that we've fought forever, is the conversations that are happening in culture, in society, find their way into the congregation. There used to be a time in which the congregation was a more shaping voice in those conversations than it is today. But congregations still have to wrestle with wokeness. My sense of it is, as a church leader, I am less concerned about the content of, do you agree with this or that? I'm more concerned with the relationship. I think wokeness goes astray when we stop being in relationship and listening to each other. And that's one of the reasons I've been passionate to use the word inclusive with our church. It came up yesterday at the Pride Fest. Somebody came up to our tent and said, oh, we didn't know that you were open and affirming. Well, open and affirming is a specific term for congregations that have taken a vote and agreed to a set of beliefs. We've not taken that vote. And my understanding from this congregation is that we want to be inclusive, which is different. Inclusive means that we see the table so open and broad that we can have people at the table who don't agree with each other, except they agree to play nice together. Right? I mean, we need to have healthy boundaries. So we can't invite people to come in who are not gonna play nice with us, but they don't have to agree with us to share the table. To me, so we try to be clear with the people that came out, we are inclusive, not open and affirming, because we want to include as big a group of people as possible. So that's where, some people might think that I'm woke. I don't know if I am or not. Because to me, what's more important is I'm in relationship with you. I mean, I know who I am. I know what I believe. I know how I feel. I was pretty clear about that when I went through Search and Call. But part of that value set that I carry in my heart is all of you, whether you agree with me or not. Let's start another sermon if we're
I
not.
know.
I was interested in what Tim said about, not recognizing church. And I've talked to quite a few young people, including some of my family, who say they don't do church. The church is, controlling, or that you have to be in certain things, or, I'm not even sure that I understand exactly what that means. But I guess my question is, how do we let people know that doing church is not necessarily what they think it is?
That's a great question. So the question was, how do we help new generations understand that doing church is not negative, or being in a box,
Or controlling?
or controlling? Honestly, I think it comes down to individual face-to-face conversations that last over time. I've never really had the experience of someone being converted because of a single sermon I preached, but I have seen people transformed because a faith community walked with them for years. I've seen that happen. And I really think that's where there's no magic bullet or simple answer that's going to fix that. The data shows that the generations coming behind us are extremely interested in spirituality, and higher power. So I think there's great hope for the church.
I mean, that's what they've said to me. I'm certainly a spiritual person, but I'm not a church person.
Yeah.
And the thing that I guess that concerns me is when you look around here, those of us, we're not gonna be here a whole lot longer. So who do we turn it over to? In terms of giving up the baton, I'm happy to give up the baton. I don't know who to give it to.
There aren't many choices.
Yeah. We have some wonderful young people in this church who I think are doing that. But how do we sustain ourselves? That's my question.
So, and I do think we're going to be benefited from trying to change the way in which we do our nominations, to think not just about nominating someone for a vote to fill a slot, but to start thinking about that process being developing leaders, not looking for people who are already prepared to be a leader. But that's part of our job, right? As church, as a faith community. That's how it is when we're a multi-generational community. That's how it was in our homes. That's how it is in our houses. We didn't just expect kids to know how to do the chores right off the bat. We had to help them learn. And when we're at our best, not only do we help them learn how to do the chores, but we help them learn what they're great at and what they enjoy doing, and then inviting them to do more of that. My parents were pretty brilliant. They learned pretty quickly that I love to mow the yard, and my sister not so much so. So guess who got to mow the yard? More often than not, I got to mow the yard because that's what I was good at. So somewhere along the way, they taught both of us how to do the chore. Then they figured out who liked to do this thing more than the other, and have that one do it. The other one, my sister's got gifts that I don't have. She's brilliant in ways that I'm not. So they found ways for her to be a part of the family that were helpful. And that's the way church works when we're at our best.
I next generation, remember, I'm not very young, I'm 50, the next generation. In this crowd, I am, but you know, the kids that are, and I say kids, the kids that are 20, 24, 25, you know, that the kids or the groups that are more lacking. When there are younger kids, they're medium kids, but then once they leave university, they're gone out of Hagerstown. A lot of them are out of Hagerstown. They don't necessarily come back. But one of the things that they look for, in my opinion, is they look for a group. Meaning like they're looking for other people like them. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there is absolutely nothing wrong. And but I think those generations between the ages of say 18 to 30, you know, in that age, you know, once they get to a family, once they're in 28, 30, they're looking for a place like here to bring their kids again and all that. But in that range between 18 and 30, there is a huge vacuum of belonging, meaning of even them not knowing where they are. And the only way, I think, is to invite them. I mean, I see it in my school, they hate school. You know, they hate it. I mean, like 75, 80% hate it. Polls that I run in my school shows that 80% of the people want to leave Hagerstown once they are 18 and never come back. I mean, these are polls, and I ask the teachers, is this normal? Do you think this is what it represents our group? And the answer is, no, it's much less. You know, most of them is 20%, you know, just leave, 80% stay. That's not how they feel. They feel rejected. They feel not belong. They're these identity crises that used to happen between 13 and 16, you know, like, I do not know who I am, I do not know what's my group. Now it's extended, you know, like from the 13s to the 20s, like it's much larger than it was, you know. People in my generation, we learned who we were at around 15, 16, and we kind of like figured out something. This generation is not figuring out.
Yeah, the research I've seen lately is that 26 is the new 18. That what we used to think of an 18-year-old being able to do, paying bills, whatever that is, now we think of a 26-year-old being ready to do those kinds of things. And now, there's some things that have happened to that generation along the way that didn't happen to my generation. They went through COVID, which interrupted a lot of their educational experience. Some of it is the way in which my generation parented. You've heard the term helicopter parent?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if your child and your parent helicopters you all the time, so you don't have to make decisions, they just give you a list of what you're doing in the morning, well then it probably delays how you're going to learn that skill set. Not trying to cast blame on any one person, but that's what the research is showing in sort of big swaths of what the experience is like. You know, another thing that the church does over time, if it's going to thrive, is to learn, you think about who to hand the baton on to. What's the baton we're handing on? You know, there was a time in which we would organize our deacons by saying, okay, this deacon crew is going to serve for the month of July, this deacon crew for the month of August. But with changing patterns of worship attendance and availability, it's better for us to say, okay, this team is going to serve this week, first week of the month. It's easier sometimes for younger families to say, I can commit to you, I'll be there 1 week a month. But I can't give you a whole month. I've got weddings to go to, I've got bachelor parties to go to, my friends are having a baby, you know, they're traveling. So sometimes we have to redesign our opportunities to fit what younger generations can do, instead of expecting them to carry the same baton we've carried our whole life and love. And it's helpful if we remember, even though they're asking to carry it differently, they're still in love with the same church, they're still in love with the same Jesus.
And they're still asking.
They're still asking. Norm.
For some reason, and I sure don't know what it would be, but all 4 of these sessions, whoever the future leaders are in this church that have been here, None of the young, I've been in all four of them, there's none of them here today. One other family had their two sons here one day, one treat. And this young man right here, he had his kids here one time. But this session about the history of the church, you would have thought some of those would wanna hear that, but they're not here.
I don't think so.
That's a great observation. I don't know how much of it is the content, that they're just not interested in history. I mean, with the number of documentaries that I see on streaming services, somebody's interested in history. It could also be the time. We may just offer this at the wrong time. We don't have a functioning young adult Sunday school class during this time because they told us that once church is over, their kids are hungry and need to eat. So we're trying other ways to provide educational opportunities for them. Alicia and I are going to offer a parenting class next school year. And we've already thought the best design is to make it a once-a-month class. And now we're going to be polling those parents to find out during once a month when would be the best time to offer. So it'll be like 10 sessions from September to, what is that, June or something like that. But trying to find other ways to engage young adults and parents in education.
I would not have been interested in the history of the church when I was in my 30s or 40s. With active kids, I would, you'd be out of here. The kids are hungry, you know, that I agree, it's just the way it is.
You may need to add that more in the service. But
I'm assuming, the gatherings that Dr. French is organizing, Sipping Sundays and La Circle, and she's asking for specific age groups that she's trying to fill the hole that's kind of in our church as far as its population goes. So my question is, now I know Sipping Sundays has been going on for several months now, and the circle is just going to be beginning, but what are the goals there, and has she noticed any difference in Sipping Sundays? Are there people coming that would not be coming to church at this point?
so some of that is evaluation we're going to do in July to look at the actual numbers and see how the numbers are going and if we need to change strategy. But both Dr. French and Alicia, we've been asking them to think about creating community. My experience of trying to help young parents be active in church and have to feel a sense of ownership in church is to build community. I got a lot of that by watching Sunday school classes like yours, and I tried to figure out what made your class so successful for so long. Why are you still here, right? And as I've looked at your class and other classes like yours, you were part of a community of adults who had fun raising your children in church. And because that was the way you related, when your children graduated and left home, you didn't leave as well. Because that's also one of the places that we lose people. We lose young people when they graduate high school and go off to college. We lose them then. But sometimes we also lose their parents because they only had a connection to the church through their children's activities. They've been youth group sponsors, Sunday school teachers. They didn't have their own community. So we're trying to do things to help those young adults have community beyond being a Sunday school teacher. I think that's why you're still here. Plus the amazing sermons that you hear on Sundays, I'm sure.
Yeah, that goes without saying. And snacks.
And the snacks. Yes, food is always good in church. Yeah. But that's actually, I wrote that into their job descriptions, was not the snacks part. I wrote in their job descriptions was that their overarching goal is to create a community of curate a community of adults who have fun raising kids in church. Well, thank you all for being here for these sessions. It's been fun to see 4 different teachers bring their perspectives to the history of the tradition that we all share together, and to think ahead about how we might share it in the future. So, thank you. Yeah. Feel free to go enjoy some Kona ice and a hot dog, and if you get on a bounce house, please take a picture.